Deployment and monitoring with Azure. Continuous delivery in Azure DevOps. In this video, we'll follow the steps to create a release pipeline. Then we'll extend release pipeline by adding stages. Following that, we will add approvals within a release pipeline, and after adding the pipelines, we'll create a release for it. Finally, we'll monitor and track deployments which we've created. We have our continuous integration or CI pipeline ready, as we've already built it in previous videos on version control and continuous integration. The build pipeline we used to set up CI already has a Docker image built and pushed into the Azure Container Registry. Let's walk through the steps to create a release pipeline. First, in Azure Pipelines or the Build and Release Hub in TFS, open the summary for your build. In the build summary, choose the release icon to start a new release pipeline. If you've previously created a release pipeline that uses these build artifacts, you will be prompted to create a new release instead. In that case, go to the Releases page and start a new release pipeline from there by choosing the plus icon. Select the empty job template. Open the Tasks page and select Agent Job. Search for Deploy to Kubernetes. Next, click on Kube Control Apply to configure it. Now scroll down and tick the checkbox Use Configuration File. Provide the configuration file by clicking on the button next to it. After clicking on it, you can see a listing of all the files present. Select your YAML file from there and click on OK. Go back to the build pipeline to check its status. Click on the build to see the logs. From here, we can see all of the job builds are successful. If you want the build to be triggered every time you make a change, you can choose the Enable Continuous Integration checkbox under the Triggers section. We can also include and exclude different branches such as development, production, or test. Now we will extend the release pipeline by adding stages. Here, you will add a new stage to the release pipeline. The two stages will deploy your app to the QA and production targets. This is a typical scenario where you deploy initially to a test or staging server, and then to a live or production server. Each stage represents one deployment target, though that target could be a physical or virtual server, a group of servers, or indeed any other legitimate physical or virtual deployment target. In the Pipeline tab of your release pipeline, select the existing stage and rename it to Production. After that, open the Add drop-down list and choose Clone Stage. Note that the clone option is available only when an existing stage is selected. Typically, you want to use the same deployment methods with a test and production stage so that you can be sure the deployed apps will behave in exactly the same way. Therefore, cloning an existing stage is a really good way to ensure you have the same settings for both. Then you just need to change the deployment targets, that is, the websites where each copy of the app will be deployed. The clone of the stage appears after the existing stage in the pipeline and has a name Copy of Production. Select the stage and in the Stages panel, change the name to QA. To reorganize the stages in the pipeline, choose the Pre-Deployment Conditions icon for the QA stage and set the trigger to After Release. The pipeline diagram changes to show that the deployment to the two stages will now execute in parallel. Choose the Pre-Deployment Conditions icon for the production stage and set the trigger to After Stage. Then select QA in the Stages drop-down list. The pipeline diagram changes to show that the deployment to the two stages will now execute in the required order. Notice that you can specify the deployment to start when the deployment to the previous stage is partially successful. Usually this means that deployment tasks were set to continue the deployment even if a specific non-critical task failed. The default, of course, is that all tasks must succeed. Following that, open the Tasks drop-down list and choose the QA stage. Recall that this stage is a clone of the original production stage in the released pipeline. Therefore, currently it will deploy the app to the same target as the production stage. Depending on the tasks that you are using, change the settings so that this stage deploys to your QA target. In our example, using the Azure App Services website, we just need to select the Deploy Azure App Service task and select the QA website instead of the production website. If you are using a different type of task to deploy your app, the way you change the target for the deployment may differ. Note that some settings for tasks may have been automatically defined as stage variables when you created a release pipeline from a template. These settings cannot be modified in the task settings. Instead, you must select the parent stage item in order to edit these items. Now we'll move on to the new topic, which is adding approvals within a release pipeline. The release pipeline you've modified deploys to test and then onward to production. If the deployment to test fails, the trigger on the production stage does not fire, and so it's not deployed into production. However, it's typically the case that you want the deployment to pause after successful deployment to the test website, so that you can verify the app is working correctly before you deploy into production. Here, you will add an approval step to the release pipeline to achieve this. Back in the Pipeline tab of the release pipeline, choose the Pre-Deployment Conditions icon in the Stages section to open the Conditions panel. Scroll down to the Pre-Deployment Approvers section and enable Pre-Deployment Approvers. In the Approvers section, choose your users from the list. You can type part of a name to search for matches. You can also clear, that is, untick the checkbox, User requesting a release, so that you can approve your own releases. You can add as many approvers as you need, both individual users and organization groups. It's also possible to set up post-deployment approvals by choosing the icon on the right side of the stage item in the pipeline diagram. Save the modified release pipeline. That's a lot covered. Now let's create a release for the steps we've just created. Now that we've completed the modifications to the release pipeline, we're ready to start the deployment. To do this, you create a release from the release pipeline. A release may be created automatically. For example, the continuous deployment trigger is set in the release pipeline. This means that modifying the source code will start a new build and, from that, a new release. However, here you will create a new release manually. So for that, first you need to open the Release drop-down list and choose Create Release. Next, enter a description for the release. Check that the correct artifacts are selected, and then choose Create. After a few moments, a banner appears indicating that the new release was created. Choose the link, that's the name of the release. After that, the release summary page opens showing details of the release. In the Stages section, you will see the deployment status for the QA stage changed to Succeeded, and also at that point, an icon appears indicating that the release is now waiting for approval. Other views, such as the list of releases, also display an icon that indicates approval is pending. The icon shows a pop-up containing the stage name and more details when you point to it. This makes it easy for an administrator to see which releases are awaiting approval, as well as the overall progress of all releases. Now choose the icon or link to open the approval dialog. Enter a brief note about the approval and choose Approve tab. Notice that you can defer a deployment to a specific day and time. For example, a time when you expect the app to be only lightly loaded. You can also reassign the approval to another user. Release administrators can open any approval and override it to accept or reject that deployment. Finally, let's monitor and track deployments. In the release summary, hover over a stage and choose the Logs link that appears. While the deployment is taking place, the Logs page shows the live log from the agent. After the deployment is complete, links to the logs for each step task are displayed in the right-hand pane. Now select any of the pipeline steps to show just the log file contents for that step. This makes it easier to trace and debug individual parts of the overall deployment. Alternatively, download the individual log files or a zip of all of the log files from the icons and links on the page.